Hi, my name is Jason Gossman. I'm a recording engineer, mixer, and editor. In the past, I've had the good fortune of working with such bands as the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Ben Harper, Metallica, and Gogol Bordello. As engineers and mixers, we all love it when we have pristinely recorded audio to work with. Great players using quality instruments in fantastic sounding rooms. You just pull up the faders and it sounds great immediately. Everything falls into place and you can spend your time being creative with your mix, which is what we would prefer to spend our time doing. The reality of the situation is that we're not always fortunate enough for that to be the case. Oftentimes there are sonic problems that need addressing, bleed between microphones, sources that become harsh when they get loud, changing tonal characteristics on a single instrument, and even if there aren't issues per se, you may want to really sculpt a sound to fit into a particular sonic space within the mix. There's definitely not a shortage of plugins in our world, and every engineer has their tricks, but there's always room in the toolbox for one more thing. I recently discovered an extremely powerful tool which has been a saving grace in some pretty tricky sonic situations, the McDSP AE400. At its core, it's a great sounding EQ, like all the other McDSP stuff. The thing for me that makes this EQ so powerful is the dynamic section here at the bottom. Each of the four bands has a completely independent bank of dynamics controls that you can use to make the EQ respond differently according to the volume of the incoming source. There are sliders for threshold, ratio, attack, and release, so you can really dial it in. What this means is you can have separate EQ curve for a sound when it's louder versus quieter without having to spend time drawing in automation. Although of course every parameter is automatable if the situation requires. If you've ever had a vocal or a guitar that gets harsh or changes tonally when it gets loud, this is a great solution. It's not like using a multiband compressor to manage it because it's dynamically controlled EQ. So you're not adding additional compression to the sound you already have. For our purposes here, it's all about the drum bleed. Drums can be problematic in that you almost always multi-track the entire kit. Many of us have been guilty of over-miking the kit, which is fun but not always useful. With so many microphones in close proximity to the source, there's bound to be leakage, which is the sound of other drums getting into microphones not intended for them. Now, the leakage can sometimes be good and help glue the whole sound together, but other times it can be a nightmare to deal with, especially cymbals. And that brings us to the old problem of hi-hat bleed into the snare microphone. And that's what I was struggling with when I first became aware of the AE400. I had tried several methods to eliminate or at least reduce dramatically the hi-hat bleed. Gating didn't really work because it sounded artificial, like I was triggering some sort of bad sample. Multiband compression really wasn't doing the thing. Then a friend of mine told me about the AE400 and said maybe it would help. Alright, so what we have here is a simple drum recording where the snare is kind of dark and lacks punch. There's also a lot of hi-hat bleed into the snare mics, which we want to minimize, especially since it would build up as the mix progresses and you start to add compression and other processing to get your mix together. So here's the sound of the original snare. So as you can hear, it's kind of dark, it's not real defined, and there's a ton of hi-hat in there. So you can definitely hear the bleed. And there's a condenser mic also on the snare top, and as well as a dynamic. But the condenser tends to pull in, if a lot of the hi-hat if it's not placed properly. And here's what it sounds like with just some straight EQ. So you can hear the snare is better, it's punchier, we carved out a little bit of the flab, but the hi-hat is going crazy. It's really out of control. So we need to sort that out. And so that's where we're going to use the dynamic section of the plugin. We'll start with band 3. As a matter of fact, let me just disable band 4 so we're not hearing any of that EQ applied. And band 3 is where I'm boosting in the mid-range, the upper mids, about 5K. And actually I'm boosting quite a bit. If you look here, here's an output display, and I'm boosting almost 9 dB of 5K, which is a lot, and it's bringing out the nastiness of that hi-hat. If you look to the right of the graph, there's a gain slider for the EQ where you can apply additional gain, or in this case we want to apply negative gain because we're going to want it to get quieter. So I'll put roughly the same amount, about 9 dB. of negative gain. And there you're essentially determining what the dynamic section is going to be triggering, boosting or cutting. And then we want to set the threshold so that the actual snare attack itself is triggering the active EQ and not the loud bleed of the hi-hat in between the snare hits. See, yeah, it's starting to trigger there. If we go too far, see how it's pulsing with the hi-hat, which we don't want. Yeah, so right in there, it's triggering. Have the attack set pretty fast, and then you can adjust the ratio to change how much of the actual curve you want to affect. Then the release you just want to set at a musical value. And ideally, in a situation like this, it would be released before the next hi-hat hit, so you're not EQing more of that than you want. Great, now I've my threshold dialed in, and you may or may not have noticed that when the snare hit, it was actually ducking at that point, since I have the negative gain here, which is not what we want. We're trying to EQ out the hi-hat bleed, and then have the mid-range come back in, pop back in when the snare hits. So there's an invert button here which reverses the threshold behavior. So we'll just engage that, and you'll see now it's popping back in, going in the right direction. And you don't have to do it that way, engaging the invert last. You can do that first and dial in the threshold. I just happen to do it the other way. Okay, so we'll listen in context. Let me mute these. I just have the active EQ processing and the fixed EQ processing on different inserts, so I can switch back and forth easily between them. So this is with the EQ and the dynamic section active, the kit overall. Yeah, that is a lot smoother. The hi-hat is there, it speaks, but it's not harsh. A lot easier to manage. So I'll play you, just for reference again, the original un-EQ'd snare top. Yeah, it's kind of dark and a little flabby, not a whole lot of punch. Here's the straight EQ'd with no dynamics. Yeah, it's a lot punchier, not as flabby, but that hi-hat is commanding everything. And then back to what we ended up with. Yeah, that is a lot better. So each band also has a key input, so you can trigger from another source. If you had a snare sample playing in conjunction with the problem snare, you could use it to trigger any of the bands of the AE400. They each have the individual internal, external key selector. And I am actually sending here, I have a send from this snare to an aux where the room mics are. I'm EQing the room mics to remove a little bit of cymbal harshness, but I want those frequencies back in when the snare hits so I can keep some of that snap. So I'm sending from the snare to bus 11, which is my key input, to this EQ, which is on the room mics. So yeah, so it's ducked out, when the snare is not playing, and then puts it back when the snare is playing. Kind of makes that a little more manageable. So obviously this is only one way to use the AE400. It's super flexible, really powerful, and I highly recommend it. If you go over to McDSP.com, there's plenty more information, and you can download a demo of this and all of their other plugins. So thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.